Hello, my name is William Cho, also known as Chobra. StarCraft, if we're counting the current timeline, then 11 years, so starting in 2013.
Did you have an interest in Brood War?
The game, yes, very slightly, but the esports, surprisingly, no, although I did live in Korea during that time as a kid. So right as the boom was starting to happen, I was still living in Korea, but my parents actually kind of didn't want me to play Brood War because at the time they thought it was too violent. Like, especially, I still remember the biggest thing for my mother was the sound of the Marines dying. And she was like, well, that's just too much. And so I only really played it at like friends' houses and PC bongs and things like that. So it was mostly like custom games and just playing against AI.
And what custom games were those?
Honestly, I was always just following along with my friends because everyone's like, oh, well, you know, the custom game scene was so big in Brood War. So everyone's like, well, this is my favorite map and this is what I liked. And I'm always like, every time I feel like I was just trying to learn a new game whenever I tagged along with my friends because they would have their favorites that they're grinding away on. So I don't remember too many, but eventually it was always, to me, just, you know, playing with cheat codes against the AI, just learning the genre of RTS. That's how far I got in Brood War.
Did you watch any of the professional matches?
I've always tried to remember if I ever really did, and I don't think I did, not in Brood War, or at least not back then. You know, I think towards the end of Brood War, I probably watched a couple online in the States, but in Korea, like on TV and stuff, I kind of knew it was happening, but more so I was introduced into the whole televised esports scene because of other games rather than StarCraft.
Oh, what other games are those?
Funny enough, the very first game that I saw that was televised was the Korean version of Gunbound called Fortress. And I chanced upon it when I was at a music camp, as it goes, over summer break, and some of the older guys like knew about, you know, the gaming channels on cable, and so they like left it on, and I was like, oh, well, I like that game, and they're playing it on TV. That's crazy. So that's the first ever televised esports broadcast I watched, and I was like, oh, this happens on TV. And then eventually I learned about Brood War and all the other games.
You mentioned like, well, I was in Korea, so that, like I kind of knew about it. Can you describe the impact that Brood War was having on Korea back in the day?
I mean, it was the game to play. I mean, if you had to at least know about Brood War. Like, you might have been like me, where your parents didn't let you play it, or maybe you didn't have a good enough PC at home, but everybody was playing Brood War. And it's, for instance, it's like when Halo first came out in the States and things like that, where it's like, you might not own an Xbox, you might not play it, but everybody knows. And if you go to your friend's house, that's what you're playing. You're showing off that game. So aside from the esport itself, it just took the whole country by storm. And it was in a day and age where gaming and computers at home, like family-owned computers, were still not that common, which is, I think, what was even more surprising to a lot of people.
So how often were you at the PC bong then? You know, because this wasn't popular at home.
For me, not too often. I mean, probably on average, like once a week, once every 2 weeks. But some of my friends, right? I mean, that's the place to go. Like after school, that's where. And especially back then, I was still, you know, in the early days of elementary school, so I was still on the younger side. But whenever we went, like a lot of the older kids, like middle and high school students, they're always there playing all sorts of games, but mostly StarCraft.
So were you paying attention to the announcement of StarCraft 2?
Yes. So while I didn't, again, grow up playing it really passionately, obviously it was one of the first games that I was exposed to that was a PvP game and things like that. And so the genre of RTS kind of stuck with me somehow. So I guess it's the bloodline, right? The Korean DNA stuck with me. So I enjoyed Age of Empires 2 a lot. In the meantime, you know, tried a little bit of Command and Conquer, and it was just a genre where I was like, well, this is always fun, even if I'm just playing against AI. And so when the announcement of StarCraft 2 came out, obviously it was a big deal in the gaming scene because Brood War had been around for so long, and it was like the game, especially in esports. So I paid attention, but I was in college at the time, and I remember I purposely tried to stay away from it because I could tell I would get sucked into it if I jumped in right from the get-go.
So what changed? What made you get into StarCraft?
Well, what happened was I had to take extra classes over the summer to fulfill my courses because I switched majors. So I was staying at an apartment over the summer, just taking, just a couple courses. That's how summer semesters go. You're not really on campus all the time. And everyone that's teaching the courses, they just want to get through it. So it wasn't that much work. And so I'm thinking, all right, I'm kind of free to do whatever I want. I've got a PC. At the time, obviously, I was playing things like Dota and League of Legends, but I was like, now's a good time to maybe dip back into StarCraft. Very dangerous choice. And that was, I think a year, maybe 2 after Wings of Liberty. So it was a little whiles out after the release, after the initial wave had passed. But something in me was like, well, I still want to try it at the very least. And I had a couple of friends from college who had been grinding it since release. So I kind of jumped right on.
So do you remember your first time playing StarCraft 2? Do you remember the feeling that it brought?
Yes. The feeling that StarCraft 2 brought, initially I thought getting into StarCraft 2, the nostalgia would come back, and I would like to think that I'm pretty good at games. I was never pro in anything, but I'm like, okay, I'm above average. The whole stereotype of I'm Korean, I grew up with RTSs around me. So I jumped in, and the first feeling that StarCraft 2 gave me was frustration. I kind of jumped into the deep end, I guess, because I was like, well, I'm sure I could beat, the beginners, on PvP. I could climb the ladder pretty easy in the beginning, and it did not go that way.
What race did you start playing?
I thought about Protoss, but I started with Terran, and I stuck with it throughout Wings of Liberty.
So when did you start paying attention to the esports scene?
So the esports aspect of StarCraft 2 caught my eye more so because I was already slowly getting interested in esports overall in the States. So obviously in Korea, there were several waves before and then of course after as well. And in the States, yeah, there were pockets of it with things like CS and stuff before that. But I feel like that was when League of Legends was coming around. StarCraft 2 was just riding its heyday. Dota 2 started announcing the international. So it was this conglomerate of, hey, like the West is also going to take part in these big tournaments all the time. And that caught my eye because I was obviously always enjoying games as a hobby, and I was always very interested in broadcasting. So it was 2 of my interests combined. So I think it was those 3 games all at the same time that caught my interest. And, in a lot of ways, especially with things like League and StarCraft 2, they were happening at the same time with things like IPL and MLG, so it worked out.
Do you remember watching any live streams, the Twitch emergence with StarCraft 2?
Not so much with StarCraft 2. I think streaming, for me, watching live streams really began with League of Legends, and more so than Twitch. Because of that, it was Own3D, back when it was still a streaming platform. Yeah, that's a trip back. So I didn't watch too many individual streams of StarCraft 2, but of course, eventually, like tournament broadcasts and stuff, I would catch on to.
And how did you start getting involved with the hosting and translating work?
So hosting and translating, again, happened more so with League of Legends first. So for me, the choice I had to make was, all right, I was interested in Dota 2, but I was very late to the scene because it was mostly at the time just pure Dota players and Dota casters moving on to Dota 2. And StarCraft 2 kind of felt similar, right? There was already a pretty hardcore base of fans, viewers, and people who worked in the scene. So while I was interested in all of them, League of Legends just seemed to be the best gateway for me, also because I had been playing it the most at the time. So, all right, let's get into League of Legends. It just so happened that Korea was getting good at League of Legends. So, okay, well, I speak a little bit of Korean. I'm enjoying watching the Korean broadcasts. And it all kind of happened very fast, one thing after another. But initially, I was very focused on casting. That's what I wanted to do. It was either casting or coaching, actually. But as businesses go and careers go, you kind of have to figure out, well, what's my advantage, right? What's my angle on this whole thing? And Smix was translating a lot of StarCraft, and I used to watch a lot of her interviews, but nobody was available to do that all the time in League. It was kind of this pocket that was empty, and Korea had just started rising up after the official release of League of Legends in Korea. So I decided, okay, that's the angle I'm going to take. I'm going to introduce Korean esports to League fans because that's different from a lot of the StarCraft fans. And that's how I got into the overall ecosystem. And then once I was at OGN, it I think it was just the same pattern of things, right? The hosting was something they were missing. Translating was something they were missing. Interviewing in English was something they were missing. All these things they were missing in English. Well, they had some casters. They needed someone who could do this. And I was originally hired mostly because I was a jack of all trades. So I said, okay, well, that's what I'll do. Started enjoying it and decided, okay, this is a pocket that not as many people are either interested in or working towards just yet.
This is actually something I haven't discussed yet with people, but you're perfect for it. Do you remember the League of Legends versus StarCraft 2 debates?
Yes, the very, very heated debates, especially online, about StarCraft 2 versus League of Legends. I'll be honest, I mean, I think most people agree now that time has passed, but it was very silly. And for me, especially watching from the sidelines, because I hadn't been too involved yet in either scene, it just seemed really dumb, to be honest. And I was a little bit more frustrated about League fans just not understanding that you can give respect to StarCraft 2 without having to like admit that it's better or worse, right? You can just say, well, it's really cool that they've actually been doing this for a while, and that's a whole different way of skill expression. It's a 1v1 game. But I feel like the League scene was pretty, I'm just going to say, I feel like they were kind of self-conscious and a little bit sensitive just because they were so new. The game was new, and there was already a lot of talk about like League versus Dota, and League was always in the crosshair, I feel, when it first started. And for a lot of new people who joined League, that was their first big introduction to like online PvP gaming, like nonstop, because it was a free-to-play game and all of those factors.
And can you kind of explain the ecosystem that was around, which was that, from my recollection, StarCraft 2 was the big dog. It came out, exploded. League of Legends was the baby brother for a very long time. Can you kind of explain that and that feelings there?
Yeah. At the time, which it feels crazy to say now, but StarCraft 2 was the main stage. Like, StarCraft 2 was the finale. It was why you went to events. Even if you didn't play it, you went for Halo, you would still watch StarCraft 2. You would go for League of Legends, you would still watch some StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 was the main dish. And that always, I mean, even to this day, there's always some type of, I think, what's the best way to put it? I think some people are a little bit wary of who's on the main stage just because obviously it draws more eyeballs and you feel that maybe we're not being taken care of as much or maybe my game's not as popular. And back then, again, it was still the earlier days of these large tournaments happening in the States, not just pockets, but just conventions, right? Convention centers being filled up. And so you really felt it. You go and you're like, well, we're in this small corner. And everyone's talking about StarCraft 2. Everyone's following the StarCraft 2 players, and everyone's here to watch that. So I think there was an aspect of that where League, on the surface, there was so much buzz around it in terms of player base and the game itself. But then you go to these events and you're like, well, like what's going on here? So there's probably an aspect of some fans feeling that a little bit.
Were you aware of the talk show where Destiny kind of went on a rant about how StarCraft 2 needed microtransactions?
Oh, I remember that happening. I don't recall that rant too much.
That's okay. But just in general, do you have any thoughts on basically like StarCraft 2 was really one of the last old box games? Right. And League of Legends was kind of ushering in that new stage of microtransactions free to play.
This whole topic of microtransactions, free to play, live service is always an interesting topic for me because I grew up playing a fun little game called MapleStory. And so to me, free-to-play always seemed like a pretty good idea. Like, MapleStory gave me so many hours of joy, and it was this game that I could always go back to every 2 years and just play a little bit again and give up on it. Granted, back then, MapleStory's microtransactions weren't as crazy as they are now. But Korea had already had so many of these MMOs and other games that kind of were the start of a lot of this live service business model. I guess Korea and China especially. So it was always a little interesting to me that it was such a big deal in the West. But it made sense once I thought about it a bit further. It was like, okay, well, it's a lot of console games and PC games that were all packaged. You always had to buy the box and install it with a CD. I will say, in hindsight, sure, you could make an argument about should there have been a shift in the business model a little bit early. Would that have helped? Yes, I think so. It would have had backlash from the StarCraft community, but it would have helped, I think, in the long run. However, I think in that moment, it's impossible for anyone, especially within StarCraft, to recognize that that was the path, because it felt like League of Legends was the rule breaker, and while League might do okay, it was like, well, League's the exception, because everyone still hates microtransactions, and everyone hates free-to-play games. Everyone has a stigma about free-to-play. No one's going to play a lot of those. League just kind of hit gold. No one else is going to do that. And so, you know, the idea of box game equals quality, that's what we go for, you pay for it, and hey, I can pay for it once and play online forever, that sounds great. It's hard to escape from that pattern.
League of Legends also had something else that was very different, which was they didn't have a campaign, didn't have story. So how important was it that StarCraft 2's campaign was, you know, actually developed, you know, good?
The idea of campaigns versus multiplayer, one of the first times I realized how big of a deal that was actually with Call of Duty. And eventually I found out it was very similar with StarCraft, where the big majority of the player base actually never really touches the PvP matchmaking. Even for a game like Call of Duty, where we think about it and its highlights are all PvP, it's 360 no-scopes and whatever else it might take. But you look at the trophies on consoles, and like 49% of the players never touch it. They just play the 6-hour campaign and they're like, all right, great, $60 well spent. Which was crazy to me, because I always got through the campaign just so I could say, I got it done, I know what it was about, it was cool, now to move on to the main game. But once I saw those percentages, I think it opened up my eyes a lot about just how much smaller the competitive community still is compared to gaming. Like, gaming is so much bigger than competitive, and then there's esports within that, right? So it's smaller pocket and then smaller pocket afterwards. But I only learned that, I would say, maybe around like 2016. It only really caught my eye in terms of numbers. So before that, I was in the same boat where I thought, I mean, the campaign's cool. I played the StarCraft campaign. It taught me a little bit, and some of the story characters are cool. But I'm not a big lore guy. I'll enjoy stories, but I'm not a big lore guy, so I didn't dive too much into it, right? And if I had to read any more than what was given on screen, I'm like, all right, moving on. Like, next campaign, let's go. So to me, it didn't matter too much. But looking back, once I learned about the stats, I was like, oh, this matters a lot.
And can you touch on the elitism that definitely existed in StarCraft 2? I mean, one of the reasons that we looked down on League of Legends, that we thought it was easier, and Brood War looked down on StarCraft 2 for thinking it was easier as well. So can you kind of just explain for, you know, the audience that perception of StarCraft 2 that day?
The elitism of StarCraft 2. First of all, I think it's somewhat founded. I do. Obviously now we've had so many different games be at the top, or at least rise near the top, and we have so many different genres that are competitive that I would hope that more people are now open to, okay, different ways of skill expression, we get it. But if you really think about it, first of all, I just think 1v1 games are the most intense way to do skill expression. I mean, it's just you, there's nothing else to blame. There's always a way to overcome it if it's 1v1. You know, whether it's time, whether it's cheesing, it doesn't matter what it is, but you have a choice. And to me, that's the best way to determine if someone's the best. There's no other factors. I think that alone, to me, brings a little bit more intensity to 1v1 games, whether it's fighting games or RTS games like StarCraft. And especially at the time, right, StarCraft had an esports scene within Brood War that had already showcased this is very competitive, and there's so many layers of skill expression and evolution, so it was already a proven competitive ground. Whereas League of Legends at the time felt like, hey, this game's kind of popular, let's see if we can do something with the whole competitive side and broadcasting side of it. And listen, I'll be honest, the very early days of competitive League of Legends, it was bad. Like, the pros were bad, and I'm sure they admit it now, because I'm sitting there, never having officially coached anything, and I'm watching broadcasts, and I'm like, this draft is terrible, and this is exactly why that opponent did, and eventually we find out in the interviews, and I'm like, how are we calling these pro matches? Like, and I think a lot of people who were interested in the game started to feel that, which is why eventually it evolved. But you compare that to a genre and an IP that had competition for so long, and those players are now coming in innovating off the bat. I mean, you have to give it to them that, yeah, I mean, it was way more competitive, and there was definitely a lot more depth at the time with StarCraft 2.
Talk about your first event in StarCraft 2. What were you first hired for?
My first event in StarCraft 2, I have to make sure I get the timeline right, but it should have been the what was it called at the time? The WCS Grand Slam? The very initial stages of yeah, and that was hosted by OGN. That would have been my first official event where the season culminated in Korea. So before that, I don't think I had ever actually worked a StarCraft 2 event. I had been near them because I worked MLG events, but I hadn't actually worked a StarCraft event before that.
I think you're talking about the WCS season finals, yes?
Maybe it's the season finals, yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. This would have been the system in like 2013, so it wasn't the first iteration.
Yes, the one very after.
The one after where you had that really conflicting, like someone just won GSL, and like the week after they were still playing like the next big thing.
Yes. Okay. It was a bad system in 2013. We can all agree on that. But yes, that would have been it. 2013 would have been the year, and it would have been the one that OGN hosted. So the global season finals, or whatever we called it at the time.
Okay, so by that point, did you have a hand on the esports, or did you kind of have to cram and like really learn a lot?
I think in terms of catching up to StarCraft 2 at the point, so I had played a lot of the game, right, at that point now with Wings of Liberty, but the esports scene itself in terms of metas and who's doing what type of builds and which player has what kind of record so far, that I had to study like it was an exam for sure throughout. And thankfully, that event, my main role was actually figuring out how to, I guess, make a reason for a second stream. That was one of my biggest goals was, okay, they wanted a second stream because of, one, the number of matches, but two, they wanted extra entertainment. Maybe that was part of the deal. I don't actually remember the details. So I had to help figure out what works for a second English stream, because nobody at OGN had ever really done that before. And then two, you're also going to host it because nobody else can, because all the casters will be busy casting. So in some ways it was good, while the production side of it was a bit of a nightmare. Obviously, I didn't have to be really deep in terms of the overall competition, because I just had to make something out of the resources we had.
Can you go into detail about how that was a disaster?
Wow. Talking about disasters, my favorite thing. Well, first of all, I remember going into all these meetings and I'm wondering, so you have to remember this, I had already kind of had my trial by fire in OGN where I spoke up a bit too much and some people didn't like that, but I'm thinking, I mean, whatever, like worst case, I don't work here anymore, I go do something else, it is what it is. But I'm sitting in these meetings and I'm trying to catch on to, okay, what's going on? Because this is obviously a very big deal. OGN's like, well, we got to do this big deal in StarCraft. And we know StarCraft and they have so much pride. And then they're constantly talking about the second stream, but nobody had any idea of what was going to happen with it. And eventually they assigned one of the producers to help produce it, but he also hadn't done too much StarCraft before. And so he comes up to me separately and he's like, okay, I need a lot of help because I have no idea what we're going to do with this. I've been given this project and we have to make something useful. We can't just say, hey, here's a stream and then people don't like it. We have to make it worth watching. So what could we do? But obviously we weren't the main show. So nobody really had the time of day for us in terms of whether it's not even about money, but no one really even had time to give us a meeting to say, here's what we can give you. So it was a lot of iterations, eventually things coming together last minute. In fact, us probably switching like segments and ideas like the day before as well, because they had to do all the tech setup separately. But we decided, okay, what are some cool things we could do? Oh, we could show things like the player POV on this stream. That could be something unique to this stream where sometimes it's a little too crazy because of the APM, but hey, it's just, hey, you want to see something new and unique? Hey, you come to this B stream and here's something fun. We're also going to just do interviews while other games are going on, just so you get extra looks behind the scenes. We'll have some of the casters come in during their breaks just to chat. It's going to be relaxed. We're not going to put too much emphasis on this being a professional show because we don't have the resources for it. So I was actually really happy that they were convinced to do that, because before that, Korean broadcasting would never do such a thing, especially OGN, because everything had to go on TV. But this didn't. It was only on the English stream online. So we were much freer, and eventually they were convinced, like, okay, you know what, mostly because they couldn't figure it out themselves and no one had the time to do it. So they said, all right, do it, we'll see how it goes. And that was the first time we got to do something very much more casual.
So, kind of a general conversation about those Korean companies. How was their handling of having to suddenly go into like a more global broadcasting? Do you recall those conversations?
Yeah. So the handling of, well, specifically I can speak for OGN, but overall I would say for Korean broadcast companies or TOs to go global was poorly done. And here's how you know it was poorly done, because one of the biggest reasons I was hired was because they had nobody who knew anything about global esports, or Western esports at the time, as we would call it. But for me, I was still so green too. I only had a year of amateur League of Legends casting, and I just started doing MLG qualifiers and did a couple, translating and interviews as a reporter. And they're looking at me being like, well, we don't know anything about Twitch. We don't know anything about broadcasting in English. We don't know what the fans want. And so, it wasn't written in pen, but my job when I first joined OGN was, again, help with how do we do marketing? How do we do social media? Is there anything we need to do for English broadcasting? And then also help with interviews, translations, casting, all of that. And obviously I was going to take the chance, but also in my head, I'm like, well, this is messed up because I've never done any of this. I don't have a business background. I don't have marketing backgrounds. And you want me to, just because I was a fan in the community of esports in the West, you want me to help figure this out? I mean, that's how lost they were. And I think, sure, credit to OGN that they would hire some guy off of that basis of, okay, he provides so many different values that even if none of it is high, it's going to be worth it for us. Sure, I'll give them credit. But also that's how desperate you were because you didn't know where else to look.
And can you kind of just explain, why OGN would be coming from such a Korean perspective?
The biggest thing people have to remember about OGN was not only was it a Korean company, but it was a TV broadcasting company. It was a TV channel. Sure, it was cable, but especially back then in Korea, TV broadcasting was very strict, right? You can never acknowledge the crew, right? That would be bad broadcasting. Like, oh, we got to pretend this is all very, very real, and the cameras aren't there. You couldn't pretend that things were recorded. So if you're ever doing holiday specialty, I'll always have to be like, wow, today's Christmas. This is so exciting. What did you get for presents this morning? Like, that was what we had to do, even when I first joined. I remember we had to do a special holiday broadcast for Chuseok, the fall festival. And we'd have to joke about, not getting to go say hi to our parents, the day of, because we're out here broadcasting live. And it's like, well, we're not really. But that was still the era that they grew up from, because that's what all the other TV channels were doing. And so even though they were cable, OGN's a gaming channel. So you're already kind of the misfit within TV channels. So you had to do everything else pristine to make sure that you were recognized. And then, even to this day, even in the West, if you're ever going to put anything on TV, obviously the laws are stricter as well in terms of advertising. And so OGN comes up from this background of everything has to follow the rule. We can't ever break the rule. We can try to bend it, but we can't really escape from the box too much. And then on top of that, Korea, generally, there's always one trend that you're following. Everyone's focusing on that. Everyone's very harsh about those standards. There's these cultural things. And then the stigma of gaming. You combine all these things, and it's like, the fact that OGN even was so successful, I think, as a gaming channel beforehand is pretty miraculous. The fact that they would do things like the creative, opening teasers and things like that, because that already broke the mold a lot from TV. But that was the maximum extent, because outside of that, how are they going to break out of this mode, especially when they joined a bigger conglomerate called CJENM? So they eventually joined CJENM. Now they're really the bottom of the bottom. They are near last place amongst all these entertainment channels that CJ owns. And so that was the office I worked in when I first joined OGN. And you could tell it was like, well, we can't ever really do something new because they're not going to like the idea, and it's not worth risking it for a channel that doesn't get views compared to everything else, especially as K-pop's blowing up and all these other things.
And you mentioned those cool openings. Can you just discuss maybe some of your favorites or how cool they were?
I mean, I think one of the biggest favorites that everyone ever talks about, if you're ever going to introduce someone to a teaser opening, is obviously the one where it's based on a comic book, right? It's drawn in the style of a comic book. And that's so cool just because, I mean, who thinks about that? You're thinking it's TV, it has to be fully animated. They used to always have the live action players doing what they thought were cool poses and whatnot. And then you tell the story through a comic book, through a manhwa style. That's so cool. And it's never really been done as well afterwards. They attempted it again as kind of an homage in League of Legends before it was known as LCK, back when it was League of Legends Champions. And when we first heard about the idea, you know, those of us that were casting back then, Monty, Doe, and myself, we were so excited because all of us knew about the StarCraft version. We're like, oh man, we're going to get a League version of this? That's so sick. But as well drawn as it was, it just didn't have the same impact, right? Because there was a story to that opening. I think that's the coolest part about it. The drawings are neat, but the fact that you were able to tell such a cool story, and you could really tell, like, okay, who's the big boss here? Like, who's getting targeted with what? Oh, you're playing these races. It's a battle among races, and that's what StarCraft fans care about. Like, it had the whole package. I think that's you have to always recognize that that's the best one.
Okay, so you started working, I believe 2013 would have been when Heart of the Swarm was out.
It just came out, or it's like coming out or something? Yeah, it just came out, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. Because I remember actually that event was when the Terran players would just nonstop Hellbat drop each other.
Ah, yes, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that was a good time. What did you think about Heart of the Swarm?
So when it comes to Heart of the Swarm, the biggest thing I have to confess is I could never like any part about the Zerg. First of all, I think they're gross looking, which is, I mean, that's the whole identity. Some people think it's cute. I think Carbot's versions are cute, but outside of that, I just couldn't ever get past the visuals and the aesthetics of the Zerg. And so when I heard that the expansion was going to be the Zerg, I was like, oh, count me out. I am not interested. And that was, I think, the biggest barrier. I just, sure, I bought it, but I didn't really dip my toes into it too much because already the main title I was working on was League, so there's already not that much time. But on top of that, I'm like, well, I'm not too interested in the story. Like, I don't really want to. And I'm thinking in my head, okay, well, Zerg's probably going to be pretty powerful because it's, this whole era is going to be focused on Zerg. So it's like, well, I'm not a big fan of that either. And so I kind of shied away. And then eventually, obviously, watching it, we all know that, there were a lot of interesting time periods in Heart of the Storm.
Yeah, please talk about Broodlord and Swarmhosts, sorry.
Man, the metas when it came to Heart of the Swarm, because you have to remember, I'm watching this as someone who likes esports, who appreciates StarCraft, but I wasn't born and bred from StarCraft. So I like to think that I had a pretty good grasp on what the general or casual viewer would want to see. And we're sitting there watching all these long-range creatures throwing things that we can't really see at each other, the Swarmhosts, and it takes so long, and then their movement isn't flat. Like, nothing about this is flashy. Nothing about this is quite interesting other than maybe if there was some crazy strategic, like, number game behind it. And yeah, sure, you can break it down, but let's be honest, at the end of the day, there wasn't. And it wasn't apparent at the very least. So it became this game of we all know what's going to happen, and we're waiting for it, but none of us wants it to happen. But also, we can't blame the players because that's the best way to do it. And if any League of Legends fans are going to be watching this, the best way to describe it is back in the days when Renekton and Shyvana were always top lane, and they're always fighting each other, and they can always regen off of each other, and they're just there. The whole 40 minutes, they're just pushing each other in top lane, and it's boring as hell, but the moment one of them leaves, they lose the game because someone else is going to push. So it just felt like that, where it's like, there's no answer to this. It's a gridlock, and it's not fun.
I believe those were kind of agreed upon as some of the most depressing years of StarCraft, actually. So I don't know if you felt that, because then you would have started to work more events during this time period. What was the feeling? I think this is when, obviously, Dead Game has existed since 2010. But that was, I think, a really powerful sentiment at that time, because League of Legends was also booming. Yeah. So do you remember getting, jobs with StarCraft and kind of that feeling that yeah.
the whole stigma about dead game, and then obviously the the Swarmhosts not helping, was really unfortunate for me because, for one, obviously I started working more StarCraft events, and that was exciting. But two, yes, it was boring. Yes, it sucked, but it didn't mean the game had to be ignored, right? You could still enjoy other parts about the game, and you could still talk about what you don't like. I always think, especially as time passes, you recognize that sometimes things are bad, but then that way we can appreciate things that are good, whether it's afterwards or maybe in nostalgia. And again, I'm not trying to excuse it. Yes, I think it lasted for too long. I think that it lasted for too long, and that was a problem. But it was always unfortunate because I felt like at a certain point, the StarCraft community started to dig its own grave a bit when League of Legends had stopped caring. League of Legends was done with hating StarCraft. They were in their own world. They were done fighting Dota. They were doing their own thing. Faker was on the scene. Like, everything was fine and dandy. Dota was done fighting anybody, right? They're like, hey, we have the biggest prize pool. And StarCraft's out here like, well, yeah, this is why it's a dead game. And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know. The League fans used to say it, but I don't think it's dead anymore. But we're kind of beating ourselves out here. But I understood why. Because you had already had to weather this storm of assault from these other games where you used to be the glory child of esports. So that sucks, understandable. And then now the game you held on to just because you still believed it was so much better and fun was suddenly not fun. And so it's like, well, now what am I really holding out hope for? So I get why it happened, but it was always so unfortunate because I thought, while yes, it was not fun to watch, or not as fun at the very least, there were still the stories of the players, and there were still other moments, with some other races, even if eventually it came to the same thing, the journey wasn't always the same. I thought there were reasons to still get excited about certain moments about StarCraft, but I think it was overshadowed by everything else that the community and the fans and the players had been kind of burdening throughout that time.
Yeah, we still had Legacy of the Void to look forward to, but it felt like
True.
forever.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
a 2-year gap, but it felt like forever. I believe you also would have started working in StarCraft 2 when there was also the transfer of all the KeSPA players.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Do you remember that? Do you have any comments on that?
KeSPA is obviously a very sensitive topic in Korea. I will just say that I think it was mismanaged, and I think, eventually, especially StarCraft, had to escape from KeSPA. It wasn't even the main game anymore. Obviously, KeSPA entered League of Legends, but they couldn't possibly have the same foothold anymore because people started figuring out how to do esports, and people started figuring out how to be self-sustaining, or as much as you can be in esports. So yeah, they were involved, but they weren't as involved in StarCraft. They didn't have as much of an iron fist. And it was dramatic. It was a very sensitive topic, but it was for the better good, And I think it was better for KeSPA as well to understand, okay, what is the type of place we can have for if we want to look long run, long term, instead of just being like, hey, we struck gold and we're going to take it over and control everything. That's not going to happen anymore. So I think it was a wake-up call for KeSPA as well. But it was rough for StarCraft because while you can say a lot of people will agree that they didn't like the impact KeSPA had, you also couldn't escape from the fact that KeSPA had so much impact that they kind of were holding things together in Korea, whether you wanted to or not. You just couldn't escape from them. So it was damaging, but it was a Band-Aid you had to pull off.
So what events did you, do you remember a list of events that you started to work with?
So the first global event that I did outside of Korea would have been Gamescom, I want to say 2013. It was the one that Bomber won, so if that strikes a chord. But it should have been 2013. So I definitely remember that, because it was not only the first StarCraft event I had done, but it was the first global event I had done outside of Korea. Because before that, again, I was just like an amateur caster in the States for League of Legends. So that was very cool. First Gamescom as well. That was crazy. I definitely remember that. I remember most BlizzCons, I just don't remember the order they happened in. But the BlizzCons I was at, I definitely remember them. I mean, just because obviously BlizzCon was the event to be at. And even if you didn't play the other Blizzard games, it was just cool to see what was happening and all these fans being so excited for everything together. I definitely remember those. And then obviously whatever I was involved in OGN. But I would say I remember the global events more just because, again, StarCraft actually helped me go more global. And that was my first eye-opening experiences interacting and working with a global community.
And can you touch on maybe the change of like how the crowd was as far as those international events versus the Korean ones?
When it comes to crowd differences, I think one of the biggest differences when going to the West was back then, still, most, if not all, tournaments were held at conventions, or at the very least, multi-title tournaments. So already the atmosphere is just way more electric than a lot of other tournaments out here in Korea. Yes, the grand finals of certain games in Korea might be much more passionate, if there's a star player, but it doesn't compare to walking into a giant convention center and just hearing the rumble of all these people and fans of all sorts of games and cosplays and whatnot. So that was a little daunting at first, and honestly a little draining. I'm also quite an introverted person, so just being around all these people was very draining. But on top of that, I think I also kind of held the stereotype that StarCraft was a Korean game, that it was it was an Asian game. Asians played StarCraft, Asians liked StarCraft, Koreans liked StarCraft. So to see these massive crowds in Europe and the States cheering for plays and chanting player names was very cool. And it really showed me that, okay, these fans are real. Like, they're so passionate, because the only way they would be this excited is if they took the time and bother to get invested into Korean StarCraft as well as American or European StarCraft. So I think it was very encouraging and just very, very cool.
Actually, I'm going to use you to explain, a great thing that happens in Korean crowds. Could you explain for the audience? You often, for like Pro League, for instance, the countdown would happen, and you'd hear people in the crowd go 3, 2, 1, fighting.
Yeah.
Could you just kind of explain that concept?
When it comes to Korean fans and cheering for players or teams now with other games, they built up this tradition of, okay, first of all, we're going to have home crowd, away crowd, more or less. So it's like you're in a stadium. So already you go in and you know where you're going to sit because you know which player is going to be playing on which side. That's kind of already known based on the bracket, or maybe they tell you. So not only are you now sitting in your zone, now you get to cheer for your player. And one of the best ways to do it was, hey, let's cheer for them at the start, but we don't have official cheerleaders, so you would have someone, or sometimes someone from the team, would lead the countdown, and then you shout for your player and team's name, because you don't have as much freedom to do that in the middle of a game, right? People are reacting differently, and when it comes to StarCraft, you're not going too crazy too often in the middle of the game, and so they built up this habit of, okay, hey, we're just going to take turns. We're going to be civilized about this. We're going to take turns. We're going to do countdowns, and you're going to cheer for your player and team, which also ended up serving, I think, for the broadcasters as a great way to just introduce the teams, right? You don't have to put too much effort into it because the crowd's doing it for you. Let's pick that up on the mic, and now it adds a little bit more to the environment. And I like that it still exists to this day, right? To every other game, whether it's League of Legends, Valorant, teams are still doing it, and the difference is now I think more teams are trying to do it officially, like they'll have someone officially doing countdowns. I know DRX Valorant has an announcer in-house that will bring a megaphone and they'll do countdowns at all their matches. So yeah, that's cool. But I like that it was a kind of self-fulfilled cheerleading squad that Korea developed.
And maybe this continues over in Korea, but I heard a lot of stories about how diehard the fan clubs were, especially in the Brood Warriors for some of those guys. You see pictures with Jaedong, and he has like a cake. Yeah. Kind of discuss that topic, how much these guys can really be stars. Yeah, actually, just go ahead and describe that first.
Fandom in Korea for anything, I think eventually, if you track it all back, it always originates from K-pop fandoms. So obviously K-pop fandoms, they're called idols for a reason. People idolize them, and the fan clubs get sometimes a little too crazy, but they get very, very passionate. And because K-pop idols usually start at such a young age, a lot of fans kind of like to see them as, whether it's someone they're taking care of, like they're their guardian. That's almost the feeling that a lot of fans of K-pop get. And so that starts to build this culture of, okay, we're going to take care of our idol, or now in the case of esports, our players. We're going to, bring them better lunch boxes than the ones served at the venue. We're going to bring them handmade, desserts and whatnot to really cheer them on. We're going to celebrate their birthday. And you see this all a lot in K-pop, and eventually it obviously moved into gaming as well. But I think the biggest thing, as you noted, that was impressive was that, okay, so these players can have the same level and impact of stardom that K-pop idols can, which is crazy to think about. Sure, the population might be different, but the impact they would have to their fan base is just as strong, if not in some cases stronger. So there's also this culture of Korean fandoms always had what we would call cafes on either Naver or Down, which were the two big search engines. So you would have these cafes, which are basically your own forums, and that's where fan clubs would be formed. Once the internet was common, that's how you would communicate with other fans, and it gets very political, like who's owning the fan club and whatnot, but that's how they organize. So even before, when cell phones weren't as common, that's how they would organize, hey, like this match is happening, or like we're gonna sit this way, or we're gonna prepare these cheerfolds, or we're gonna prepare this kind of gift. They would pool, money together, and then they would buy the gifts. And so it all originates from there. But yeah, as you mentioned, it extends from whether it's cakes, desserts, sometimes lunch boxes, it's birthday parties, it's fan club meets, right? Where they would have meetings with the fan clubs, and sometimes the fan club is the one that's organizing it and they'll kind of run it. And it's very, very well organized and intense, but also I think it's very rewarding for the players to know that that's the impact I'm having.
And then it seems like in Korea, there's always been a more stable female population in the crowd. Very famous, like it used to be a meme that women would cover their faces whenever the camera went on them. Can you describe that, and then maybe any guesses as to why that's been?
I'll be honest, the girl fans or women in the fandom, I've never actually quite understood, especially when it comes to StarCraft, because by the time League of Legends rolls around, okay, League has a bigger player base of girls, right? And they have characters that cater to the girls. Okay, that makes sense, and then eventually now, like gaming just in general, caters more to the overall population. But back with StarCraft, that was not the case. And the only thing I can think of is the Korean TOs at the time really had a good grasp on, hey, all of our players are men, they're guys, some of them are good looking, they're playing on a stage, we're just gonna make them look really cool. And I would say they succeeded, right? I mean, again, some of those opening teases were silly, but some of them you're like, whoa, I did not think this guy was this good looking, and you're seeing him in charismatic poses. I think that did a lot for the fandom, because that was, again, the beginning of K-pop fandom as well, and so you have these communities that are latching on to whoever they think is either good looking or cute or just charismatic, and then eventually now you're learning the game to support this player, and then you're like, okay, well, like now their skill expression is really cool too. And it probably also helped bring out the very few that were the, kind of hidden pockets of StarCraft fans among girls, where they probably didn't have too many people to talk with when it comes to the game. But now that this is televised and these guys are looking cool on the stage and they've got uniforms, they're like, okay, well, now I can kind of express my fandom a bit. So I have to imagine, but yeah, that's something that's puzzled me, and I've never quite found the answer myself, because StarCraft was the one game where I'm like, I don't know where this started. But the only thing I can think of is, okay, all of our players are guys, we're going to make them look very cool, and I think the television aspect helped a lot.
Can you talk about the region lock?
Okay, so the region lock was something that I remember having or being part of the discussions for as it was being discussed and prepared, but by the time it rolled around, I had already kind of started to step away from at least the thick of things with StarCraft, right? Again, I'm not sure of the timeline myself, but I was probably still involved in like the BlizzCons or something like that, but I wasn't regularly part of the league. I wasn't regularly doing all the traveling events. And so I remember obviously following the heated arguments and debates about, is this good, is this bad? What is this gonna do for the scene? Is it gonna kill the scene even more? Like, what's gonna happen here? And the only thing I remember is there wasn't an easy answer. I don't think it's dry, cut and clear of it's either good or bad. But the way it's implemented and the process, there's definitely a good and bad way to do it. And in my memory, the choice wasn't made towards the good side. It was a bit more abrupt, and it wasn't very well explained, for one, because there was so much debate prior. And I think that plagues a lot of games even now, where it's like you make a big change and it might be better in the long run, but you have to understand that the overall community, and even the pro players usually, especially the pro players, they're not able to look that far ahead. They're concerned about, okay, well, what does my next year look like? Like, what tournaments can I play in? How am I making my money? This is my lifeline. And so you have to go to really far extents to explain this well and convince people to get on board. And I don't remember the initial exact details of how it was implemented now, but I do remember for sure thinking, well, this was not the way to introduce it, because no one, like even the people who think this is a good idea, is not going to be on board with how you introduce this. And I think that was, another thing in the mix of things that just didn't go well in the middle of StarCraft 2, where it really was bad timing.
And with some work now, what are your opinions on, was it effective? Did it do its goal?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Was region lock effective? Okay, so I think, obviously, I'm not going to say I've done my research, but just off the top of my head, I'm going to say that region lock itself probably ended up being effective. Region lock itself. But that's when we look at it in a vacuum. Was it healthier overall? Probably not. And also, were there other factors combined with that ended up being more damaging, so they cover up any good that came out of it? Yes, I would say so. But yeah, I'm gonna say, yeah, if we were able to take it out in a vacuum, it probably got what it wanted done as a goal.
Do you think that it was a major contribution to the decline of Korea StarCraft?
I think region lock was very detrimental to Korea. So this is one of the biggest parts about region lock, right? Because obviously it was, let's just be honest, it was intended to help not Korea. It was intended to help everybody else but Korea, but also it was quite damaging for Korea. And in hindsight, I think at the time people would have argued for like prize pool and opportunities and whatnot. But in hindsight, I think one of the biggest things that was detrimental was that this was a time period when everything was going from Korea to global. League of Legends was going from Korea to global. They were trying to make even the Korean League as global as possible. They were, and Riot was doing international. They were trying to figure out their own system of international events. Korea was trying to partake in every global game possible, even if it wasn't going to succeed in Korea. Korea was taking part in Dota 2. And Korea was like, whoa, okay, gaming's a big deal. Esports is a big deal in the West. Like, we should do something. Like, games that should not have had English broadcasts were having English broadcasts. And then StarCraft was like, hey, we're going to silo you guys back into Korea. And in hindsight, it's like, okay, this was the worst time to do it because that wasn't the trend in esports and just the overall ecosystem. You had to figure some other way, and maybe some of the community in the West would dislike it, but at the cost of the Western scene having to figure out a different way to grow. But in hindsight, I think that was the biggest thing because you have these other games that Korean fans are now getting excited about, global players and foreign players and how they match up against Korean teams and players. And then StarCraft 2 is like, well, we're in our own little pocket. And yeah, eventually we'll still be the best, but it is what it is. And it's not even the most popular game in Korea anymore. So it just started compounding on itself.
There are a lot of things that happened that year, actually.
Yeah.
But before we get to the big one, actually, this did happen first. You actually did host the 2015 WCS Global Finals, aka BlizzCon. I don't know if you remember, but that is where SOS won. He won his second.
That was the SOS one, yeah.
World Championship, and it was versus Life.
Yes.
Yep. And that was also where there were some show matches for Legacy of the Void. So we'll talk about both of those things. But first of all, what was the experience of hosting a BlizzCon? How was that?
Oh, hosting a BlizzCon is definitely one of my favorite memories, and probably one that I hold in honor, especially in like the top 3. And I mean, it's kind of easy to say what the top 3 would be. It would be the biggest tournaments, right? It would be like BlizzCon, the International, and something else. So it's I guess Katowice actually for any of the games, but it's obviously a big deal. But also just because even though they're all segmented, right, all the different games at BlizzCon and whatnot, just to think about the feeling of I'm part of something bigger than StarCraft, and all these people here, some of them are here just for StarCraft, some of them are here for Warcraft, and now they're here for StarCraft. That is a feeling you can't really describe, and you can't get anywhere else, especially not anymore. Conventions are dying out. Multi-title conventions are dying out. Nobody's hosting grand conventions anymore. I mean, Gamescom still survives, but that's about really it. And so you can't really get that feeling of we're all in this together. You still have things like DreamHack, but let's be honest, you're there for what you're there for. Yeah, you'll browse around, but you're not taking part. You're not guiding everyone from one stage to the next and taking turns of celebrating together. And so that's a unique experience. Also, that was still the day when Blizzard was it. Like, Blizzard was the end goal of anything involving video games. And so, hey, I get to be a part of something Blizzard is doing. Oh, it's actually the end goal of Blizzard? Like, not even just esports, it's the end goal of Blizzard is BlizzCon. Like, we're gonna introduce the biggest things about Blizzard this year. Oh, I mean, yeah, I mean, anyone would take that chance back then.
Do you remember the stage?
That was the one where it was in the dome, correct? Yeah, so 2015, I do remember the stage because it had, I can't remember exactly which technology it was, but the stage had the design of basically like you were in, the spacecrafts and whatnot of StarCraft, and the players were like in their little cockpits or the windows. And thinking about it now, it's a little cheesy and how it was implemented. But back then it was cool because, I mean, first of all, it was very big, and that helps. A big flashy stage is very nice. But also, we got to have our own big stage to celebrate the end of the end of the year for StarCraft 2. And that was cool because I think it was a good reminder that, okay, there's all this talk about dead game and, League of Legends is the best game right now in the world, but, no, StarCraft can gather enough people at BlizzCon where tickets are sold across the board for all the games, and enough people are showing up to fill this arena and to celebrate. And also, I think there's always something very cool about elevating players where they just now seem larger than life. And so that stage was pretty cool, even if it's a little cheesy in hindsight.
Was that the year that they had a power outage? Do you remember?
Oh, it might have been, because I do remember some chaos in the backstage room of that stage. So yes, that might have been it.
It was a long wait. All right, so let's talk about the tournament itself. So I don't actually remember the games too much, even though I was there. But everyone remembers it because SOS won his second BlizzCon championship, right, and he defeated Life, who was seen as one of the greatest at that time. So can you touch on that?
So that finals for SOS beating Life, for me, it was memorable because I was actually a big fan of SOS and just how he played. Just his kind of, let's put it, off-the-cuff style, his the safe way to put it is non-traditional, but his crazy cheesy styles and just his own builds, and he plays like he doesn't have a care in the world, and he interviews like he doesn't have a care in the world, and he just gives us this vibe that I'm just smarter than all of you and I don't really care, but he's not cocky about it. And so, especially also getting to talk to him backstage a couple of times, I'm just like, oh, I really like how he plays and thinks about StarCraft. He breaks the mold. And I love mold breakers when it comes to any game. I love people who defy the meta a bit. And so I thought that was always, I wanted to see him succeed. And also I thought he kind of embodied what I viewed Protoss as, which was breaking the mold. That's how I would view Protoss. So I was like, oh, this is perfect. So not only did he beat the person who at the time everyone kind of agreed was the best, which was Life, but also it was getting to see someone who didn't necessarily follow the rules standing on top, and kind of definitively at that point, right, winning his second global final. So that was, I think that was the BlizzCon that afterwards I wrote this long blog post, which I like never did before and nor after. But it was just a very emotional and memorable moment because I felt that the culmination of SOS winning and how people were reacting and the meta and all of that really embodied what was fun about StarCraft and why 1v1 stands different from team games. Like it showcased all of that for me.
I believe you also were there translating and hosting for the Legacy of the Void show matches. Do you recall those?
I do recall them happening. I'm going to be honest, the Legacy of the Void show matches, they are gone to the void itself in my memory.
That was the amazing time where they showcased Archon mode because they thought it would be they thought it would be the next big thing. And the Herc was still involved. So MC was like microing the Herc.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, no, okay, now, yeah, I remember. It was a little silly.
Yeah. Well, actually, the question I want to ask you is, what did you think of this announcement of Archon mode, which harkened back to the team melee of Brood War? You thought it was a good idea?
I mean, on the surface, Archon mode I thought was a good idea. I mean, it was a refreshing thing for StarCraft, and it was a way to try to get more people involved, which is something that a lot of people felt StarCraft was lacking, right? StarCraft really seemed to dig too deep into the, hey, we're 1v1 type of deal. And I thought we would get a lot of silly moments from it. Obviously, not so much in a pro setting, but just overall, okay, this is a good way to make something novel. And I think that's important. That's something I've latched onto for quite some time once Hearthstone had been released, because I remember getting to visit Blizzard when Hearthstone was still in development and talking to that team. One of the things that they mentioned was the word novelty. And they were like, well, it's very important to us that every game is novel. And that's what we want to focus on. And I remember thinking, oh, that's not a word I've really ever thought of when it comes to why games are good, especially online games. But that's actually so true. Because even for me, listen, I'm a little bit of a degen. I like to gamble responsibly in games where I don't have to use my money. Hey, RNG seems kind of fun. When the chances are up in the air and I just kind of leave it to fate, it's kind of exciting. And so I thought, okay, if you can strike that chord where it is RNG or there's some RNG factor, it's not all under your control, it's not all mathematical, but it is balanced. Okay, now you get these new moments. And that was what, at the time, Ben Brode had explained to me when I was visiting about why he thought Hearthstone worked, was that every time there was a new thing to talk about. After every game, you're like, well, this time this happened. Like, that was cool. And so I was like, okay, well, now you're adding in, another factor. It's not just you playing StarCraft. Okay, sometimes it's going to be frustrating, but I think it's going to lead to funny moments, which will just create more things to talk about when it comes to StarCraft.
So the other show match that happened was called the Legend show match. It was Nesty and Yellow versus MVP and Boxer. Did you, these are names that apparently, you actually weren't intimately attached to.
Sure.
Yeah, but do you remember reading up on them, researching them, and just being kind of like, okay, this is a history?
Oh, yeah. I mean, those four legends, obviously, even if I wasn't intimately attached, first of all, it's names that I would recognize, but also then really reading into, okay, what does it mean, and things like that. It was an honor to be involved in a show that involved those four. But also by then, people like Boxer and Yellow had been much more exposed to the general audience in Korea, right? They kind of became celebrities on their own outside of StarCraft after their pro careers. And so there was that aspect of, okay, these are people that I could tell people outside of games in Korea and they would still know that it's a big deal that we got to work with these guys. So yeah, that's a little nerve-wracking. And I think it might have been before that event. I think it was, but I had a chance to stand next to Boxer during one of the Star League finals, I think, where they interviewed him like as a pregame interview, and I had to help translate it. And I'm standing next to this guy, and that was one of the most nervous translations I've ever done, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is an absolute legend. Everybody knows who he is, and everybody's just waiting to hear him talk, no matter what he says. And so I knew the weight of what it took. But then, yeah, the rest of the guys as well, even if I wasn't as familiar with them compared to, obviously, the top dogs like Boxer, I understood the weight of it. And that was a very, very, very big moment